Hey everyone, we meet again. It's another free chapter reading from my book, Turn Your Magic All the Way Up, A Ridiculous Guide to Discovering Yourself After Narcissistic Abuse, available on Amazon, Kindle, Paperback, also audiobook, read by me, or just tune in here every week. I'm going to be reading a chapter for free. And I wanted to kind of explain this little book with the long title. I meditated on what to name this book. And this is the title that came to me, and I shit you not, I was like, really? That is like the longest Panic at the Disco emo title ever. Everything I've ever read and heard about book titles is you want it short so that people can easily say it. This is not short. It's not easy to say. It's not even easy for me to say when people are like, oh, you wrote a book. What's the title? I'm like, oh, but this is what the universe told me to title my book. So I titled my little book with the long title, Turn Your Magic All the Way Up, A Ridiculous Guide to Discovering Yourself After Narcissistic Abuse. So here we are. And here we go. This is chapter 5. I did write this book with a musical soundtrack, and the Spotify playlist to that soundtrack will be in the link below. And I will also be listing songs as I was listening to them and as I wrote this, in case you're interested what was going on through my little brain as I wrote. So here we go. This chapter is a little long, so hang in there. Chapter 5, Parenting and Other Crap That All Ties Together. Song, Life's About to Get Good by Shania Twain. How many toxic cycles are broken because, thank fuck, there are people out there who say, not my kid, and save the world. They stopped their own cycle of creating more damaging narcissists, and we need more like them. Bless those parents. If we could just all be better parents. And goddammit, how hard is it really to not abuse your kid? Why is it that asking the bare minimum seems too much these days? It hurts my heart. I've never had one, but I was one. And the way I was parented shaped everything about me now. As it did you too. Talk to your kid. Spend time with your kid. Pretend like your kid is worth a damn. You wanted them. How about you validate them and tell them that you're glad they're alive and you're glad you had them? Tell them every day. Your kids deserve that when they're young and unsure of everything. Let them know they are worthy humans just by being alive, not by what they produce. Maybe in turn your kid, instead of saying, fuck, I wish I'd never been born in this shithole world, might instead start saying, hey, I'm glad you had me too, Mom and Dad, because parents deserve that too. But it starts with the kids. The kids must be parented, not just allowed to grow up. And they're not your friends, they're your kids. You're going to have to sit back and watch them fail, and it's going to hurt to watch. But if you keep saving them every time they fall down, they aren't ever going to learn to stand back up again on their own. They will never learn from their mistakes. They will only learn to wait for you to save them. I don't know why all this seems so hard, but apparently it is. My disclaimer is always going to be, I'm not a parent, but of course it's easier to say how you should do things when you've never done them yourself. I see you, parents. I know it's a thankless job. I do thank you for trying. Just know this. Per Maya Angelou, when you know better, do better. For all of us, okay? I can say without blame that it's because of the lessons I learned from my parents that I found myself in the predicaments with these narcs each time, because I had been subtly programmed by my narc dad my entire life. Parenting matters. After narc number 1 is when I finally heard a tiny voice saying, hey, maybe I am who I am loving so much and not him at all, because he wasn't real, so it couldn't have been him. Here is where the first twinklings of, hey, little girl in there, we are finally going to recognize all those strides you took to be perfect and awesome and just a good human for all those years. You trained your whole life to be a cool chick. We're going to let you enjoy all your hard work for once. Song Let Me Get Me by Selena Gomez. The more I let go, the more magic has happened in my life. Quote unquote magic, do as you will. Another lesson from The Last Unicorn, that's a movie, is that the unicorn starts to forget who she truly is the longer she is trapped in a life that isn't hers. The more we remain in situations where we don't belong, where it feels unnatural to us, where we feel stuck but are quote unquote making it work for whatever reason, whether it be job, kids, family, sickness, etc. These situations are toxic to your soul, and you will lose your identity completely if you stay where your true self is stifled. I realize that not everyone can pick up and follow their dreams right this instant. Of course, that isn't realistic. What is realistic, though, is to set goals to reach your dreams eventually. Goals equal hope, and hope is important. Only time is your obstacle. Besides, changing yourself can start right fucking now. The only obstacle there is you. If moving would make you happy, start planning now anyway. Even if it isn't feasible until your kid turns 18 and they leave the house. Start making plans just for kicks. Start playing pretend like it's going to happen tomorrow. Just giving your brain some hope that one day you will do what truly makes you happy will start the creative juices flowing. This also plays back into my idea that we all should allow ourselves to follow whatever daydream and creative thought we might have without any judgment. Because, quote unquote, creative brainstorming will literally unlock your mind from feeling stuck, from feeling unhappy and miserable. It will create new pathways for you to consider that just might open your eyes to being able to do something about your current unhappiness sooner rather than later. Let your daydreams go and see where they lead you. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Life is too damn short to be unhappy, people. We are here to find our joy. Settling or quote unquote just getting by isn't supposed to be part of the program. Fear keeps the majority of us stuck. Fear of the unknown, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of paying bills and feeding yourself, fear of being homeless, etc. These are all very rational fears, and please never kick yourself for feeling stuck. These are scary things, and all of us are in the same boat. As we addressed earlier, change and the unknown is scary, but plans help you work around them with realistic answers. The more prepared you are, the more research you do, and the more knowledge gathered, the more confident you will inevitably feel about finally making the changes you're wanting. Don't give yourself too many deadlines. They can stifle creativity and give a judgmental brain another reason to make you feel guilty for missing imaginary timelines. Just list it as a goal. Actually write it down, and before you know it, your far-off goals might just start becoming plans. You might just find you can start doing something about what you want right now. I spent years telling myself that I was a terrible person and being hard on myself because I was so miserable and unhappy. I wouldn't give myself permission to be depressed. I repeatedly told myself what a shitty person I was, to not appreciate how blessed I was and how lucky I was, and that I should be ashamed of myself for not being happier. It was a cycle of despair. I was stuck and I didn't even see it. Song I Hope You're Happy by Blue October. I recently read a few journal entries from my married days where I just demolished myself, unloading about what a terrible human being I felt that I was and that I hated myself. I remember feeling utterly insignificant and not worth the space I took up back then. I remember being severely depressed. I did not, however, remember the amount of vitriol I was spewing at myself on a daily basis, though. Yikes. Rereading those journal entries really woke me up to how hard I was on myself mentally just a few short years ago. And that's just what I was writing down. Imagine what was in my head constantly 24/7. Perfectionists and people pleasers are far too hard on ourselves. Jesus, no wonder I had some serious breakdowns. I didn't deserve that kind of abuse. No one does. I was only doing the best that I could with the knowledge that I had at the time. I should not have been so hard on myself when I was just trying to do better every day. And also, no wonder I was so miserable. I was completely out of touch with who I was, what made me happy, what I wanted to do with my life, and I had zero understanding about my childhood trauma, which was the cause for all the things I was questioning. Discovering yourself is the most important thing that you can do. The sad part is I look back on those days and see that I was trying so hard to figure it all out. I thought I was doing everything right. I was doing everything I knew to do to help myself, quote unquote, snap out of it, but I was missing one key piece. That simple recognition of childhood abuse changed everything about my internal struggles. Once I could finally see why I was overreacting to things, why I was a perfectionist, why I felt guilty all the time, why I constantly felt unheard and not important, why I had low self-esteem, was all tied to the emotional abandonment I felt as a child. I could start actively changing things. Abuse is a painful acknowledgement, but a liberating one. So fucking frustrating that it took so long. How could that one answer make such a difference? Parenting. I am unraveling the importance now. It's why it was one of the first things I mentioned in this book. It is the thing that saved me. It is the thing that I was in denial about without even realizing it, and now I feel compelled to help others recognize it so that they can start fixing it even sooner than I did and start a whole new positive trajectory in their life. All of this is to help people. All of it. Sidebar. If I repeat myself, please forgive me. Mushrooms and weed are a key ingredient in my creative juices recipe. See the upcoming drugs chapter. And I am editing this little darling myself. Maybe not the best idea, but it's what the universe had pointed me to do. Just know that I see that I often repeat myself, but if I do, it's because it's important. Okay, back to the book. Actually, that's a sidebar that I legit wrote down. So, legit sidebar. Here we go. My dad is one of those boomers who thinks that therapy just digs things up that upset you worse than if you had just left them alone. Wrong. He also believes therapy is just an excuse to blame all your problems on your parents and not take accountability. Also wrong. You don't have to hate your parents to realize and admit that they neglected or abused you. Most parents were just doing what they knew to do because it's what they were taught and how they were raised. So they saw it as normal just as much as you see it as normal now. But it ain't normal. While I believe most parents are doing the best they can, I also know that some individuals might deserve your hate and some might need to be avoided completely and written out of your life once you wake up to the reality of the abuse you experienced or are still experiencing. After all, some parents are narcissists. Everyone's lives are different. No one is better or worse than anyone else, and please know that trauma is trauma. Big T trauma, like sexual abuse, physical abuse, being denied food or safety, or little t trauma, the more insidious eroding of your inner confidence and verbal, emotional abuse, they all leave scars that need to be handled, and one is no more valid than the other. Trauma is fucking trauma, and don't ever let anyone tell you what you should or shouldn't feel, ever. I highly advise everyone to do this kind of emotional digging with a professional therapist because I've heard some stories from my narc exes about the incredibly sadistic things humans and worse, family members do to each other. If you have something repressed that comes up, you'll want a pro to help you through that. Pardon me while I scratch my nose. My father was not strong enough to see the cycle of emotional neglect/abuse his parents handed down to him and didn't know how to stop it, so he passed it down to me. To this day, he lives his life based on fear and lack. Fear drives his life, and facing your own truth is a fearful thing. He simply wasn't brave enough to face the truth and handle the shame and guilt of what his parents did to him. I don't know why I'm the one who is strong enough to face it, but I'm glad someone in the family is. This kind of mental digging is difficult. It's shame-inducing. It's heartbreaking, and you are going to grieve the fuck out of the life and the relationship you thought you had with your parents once the truth is out in the open and exposed to daylight. Song Last Hope by Paramore. We need to learn to own our shame and talk about it more. Shame has ripped my family apart. Let me tell you about shame. Shame is what made my racist grandfather disown his only daughter when she got pregnant by a black man. Shame is what ate him alive when that daughter was murdered, and because he had refused to speak to her, he never got to say goodbye. But it sure reduced him to a rare occurrence of tears at her funeral. R.I.P. to the aunt I never got to meet. You were a beautiful soul ahead of your time that I wish I could have gotten to know. Too little, too late, and all because of shame. Shame is what caused my grandmother to adopt the children born from her husband's adulterous relationship without ever explaining where they came from. We lived a lie because of shame, because no one wanted to talk about the truth. I know I came from a long line of stubborn, intelligent, strong women who divorced early, way before it was acceptable. But I know none of their stories, and not even what our country of origin is, because no one talked about anything because of shame. Family motto on my dad's side: don't talk about it, don't ask questions, it's none of your business. I am here to lay all my shame on the table. As I mentioned in an earlier chapter, I think that if people talked about the things that they're ashamed of more, they would realize that everybody has something they feel ashamed of, and it's normal to experience it. I think that if we spoke up more about abuse and who was doing the abusing, that the person who deserves the shame will be the one to carry it instead of passing it on to the victim. Because right now it sure seems like the victim always carries the shame and guilt when none of it is theirs to begin with. The abusers, meanwhile, are wandering around scot-free. By bringing it to light and telling our stories without shame, it will then place the shame where it should have been all along, on the abuser, who would, in an ideal world, then use that shame to change for the better. It can only help the good people in this world to let go of the burden of shame when it isn't ours to carry. I know my dad is a covert narc now. It's what his parents built him to be, and they succeeded admirably. Like being able to name that I was abused, naming what he really is has helped me learn how to handle my relationship with him. I had allowed his opinions and his judgments to weigh heavily on all aspects of my life. I carried guilt of being a failure and a burden to him everywhere I went. I would never ever feel like I was enough if I hadn't woken up to who he really is and let go of all that crap. He's lower on that narcissism spectrum now that he's 74. He is honestly trying to change himself and be more empathetic, and for that I commend him. He is trying. It's more than most narcissists will ever do. Now that I know how to speak his language, I can have boundaries when dealing with him. I can't speak for where he was on the narcissism spectrum when he was married to my mom, but I'm pretty sure he wasn't pleasant to deal with. He was an alcoholic from the time I could remember until I was 12. Just this past December, when I asked him something about a time when I was younger, he informed me that he couldn't remember anything from that period because he had, quote unquote, blacked out my entire childhood. This was incredibly hurtful to hear, like a knife to the heart of my little inner girl. Message received: I don't matter. No wonder I constantly feel unheard and not important or worth listening to. It was instilled in me subconsciously long before I could ever realize where those thoughts and beliefs about myself came from, or that I should even question them at all. And my father has the audacity to question why I fell for these narcissistic, abusive men? Please, try looking in a mirror next time you ask that question, Dad. When I was sharing this hurt with my mother, she painfully pointed out that it meant that he had, quote unquote, blacked out their entire marriage as well. And my heart broke for her. What a painful 12 years that must have been. Living with a covert narcissist and raising 2 young children, with a third out of state living with his narcissistic father, must have been tough. I was a child and didn't see the truth of it all, but she was an adult, being neglected in an emotionally abusive marriage, all alone, long before she knew what a narcissist was. To say I am disappointed in the way my dad handled his relationship with my mom and I while I was growing up is putting it very lightly indeed, and I am still working through the emotions that this has dug up for me. 12 years of narcissistic abuse. My poor, incredibly strong mother. Just ouch. Ouch. Now that I know what that's like, I cry for her, even now. But looking back with the knowledge that he's a narcissist who can't logically think about anyone other than himself, and understanding why I feel the way I do is because of the years of training he gave me, allows me to see things with a newfound clarity and understanding. He was typically cold, showing zero emotions except for explosive anger or just fine, thanks. He valued money first and children to be quiet, obedient, rule followers, because that is exactly what his parents modeled for him. He became what his parents programmed him to be. He had no other option. They raised him so coldly, with so little emotion, because that is what they got. And hey, it had worked just fine for them. My father, an innocent little boy, was raised with no affection or love. Intelligence, self-sufficiency, and money were valued instead. I feel very badly for the child that he had been that was emotionally neglected. My heart breaks for him too. I asked my dad recently what he had wanted to be when he grew up, what he had daydreamed about when he was a kid, and he said he didn't remember ever daydreaming about anything. That is so terribly sad to hear. And I know it's not his fault. That's the fault of his upbringing and his programming. It's difficult to stay mad at someone for too long when you realize it was their parents who broke them. Unfortunately, this is exactly what a narc counts on with a trauma bond, so you really have to be careful with stories of abuse. It isn't my dad's fault he is the way he is. Fuck, it wasn't even his parents' fault. He was broken down at such a young age, his true self fractured, and he learned to shut off emotions completely. Emotions were too painful, not valued, unnecessary, and just made you vulnerable to shame and embarrassment. The worst things, according to my grandparents, apparently. Song Cowboy Take Me Away, the piano version by Lissy. I grieve for the person that little boy could have grown into, had he been raised in a home with love and empathy and compassion instead of coldness. Of course my dad came out the way he did. My father's lack of emotions and absence of any validation of me as an individual caused an empty hole to form in me at a young age. Around age 2 or 3 is when I started having memories about being let down by my father. This is where my former need for outside validation stems from. I was constantly searching for someone to tell me I made them happy, I did a good job, I am smart, I am pretty, I am important, I am worth listening to, because I never got these things from my father. Because my own identity was fractured from emotional neglect and abuse, I was never able to validate myself at all. I was constantly needing other people to reassure me that I was enough. I carried with me an empty, gaping chasm where my own self-approval, self-esteem, self-love, and self-acceptance should have been. and I tried to fill it up with words from others instead. I know most codependents feel the same. When I think about why validation from others was never enough, I can describe it like this. That empty, gaping chasm is dark and deep. I gather words and throw them in. I held these words in my hands where I physically felt them. They were real. I heard those words in my ears. I watched myself throw those words into the chasm and expected to see them pile up on top of each other where I could watch them stack up enough to fill the chasm all the way to the top so that it wasn't empty anymore and I would finally feel good about myself. Instead, when I throw those validating words from other people in that chasm, I watch them disappear into the blackness and be gone as though they never existed. Does this sound familiar to you too? This is why validation from others will never work to fill that hole inside of you. You need to figure out a way to validate yourself and really fucking mean it. Otherwise, you're going to keep gathering words from other people, throwing them into your chasm, and they're going to disappear and you're going to keep feeling empty. The chasm can't be filled from the top down. It's got to be filled from the bottom up, from inside out. You've got to validate yourself and teach yourself to believe in your own words. Life lesson number 5. Love yourself. Validate yourself. Be your own knight in shining armor. You deserve it. Song Nicer by Caitlin Tarver. Another good example of the hidden trauma you can experience in your childhood comes in the form of when a sudden illness strikes the family. To my parents, it was merely a setback, so it wasn't really discussed much. It just was. To me, as a child, it shaped my identity for life. In the summer of my 2nd year, I was my mother's shadow and I worshipped and idolized her. I was super codependent from a very young age because my mom was the parent who showed me love and affection and was an empath like I would grow up to be. She validated my existence. I felt like a real person in her presence. My dad, on the other hand, was just intimidating and standoffish, always seemingly awkward around me, and never really knew how to talk to me, so I just avoided him and certainly didn't feel comfortable around him. As I said earlier, he was also an alcoholic. I knew he said he loved me, but it was an understanding more than a feeling. Mom was my rock and my happiness, and she was good at recognizing and validating all of my emotions. I could feel her love, and I loved her back. And then one fateful Sunday morning, she fell and blew out her back, and my development and emotional life trajectory changed forever. I remember that traumatic event. She had fallen on stairs, and I could do nothing to help her. I was 2. I could only stand by and watch as others tried to assist. There were people rushing everywhere. Mom was obviously in severe pain and crying while we waited for the ambulance to arrive. It was chaos, and I stood on the sidelines, shell-shocked and silent, watching it all unfold. I felt helpless and didn't really know what was happening. Fast forward, and I remember her being put on bed rest and traction before having spinal surgery and a few months worth of recovery time. Just a few months worth. But in my baby brain, I could not rationalize any of this. And so when I saw Mom fall and be put in bed with traction due to spinal damage, I thought she was never going to walk again. I thought she was going to live in bed from now on, and me and Dad would have to take care of her. I felt at 2 years old that, well, Mom's hurt, so now I have to be a grown-up. I took that upon myself without telling anyone. Mom was now bedbound and hurt, so I certainly wasn't going to weigh her down with my concerns. I was supposed to stay happy and chipper and upbeat for her while she was in bed and depressed and sick. And tell Dad? Right. We didn't even talk to each other, remember? Dad was now running the house, though, and making meals and cleaning, and it was immediately such a colder environment. Meals were quick and served without love. Choices were limited. We ate what he gave us, and from the same plate, same cups, same silverware, so he wouldn't have to wash too many dishes. It was all about his comfort and making things easy for him. I thought of myself as an annoyance, just another burden like Mom for him to take care of when he so clearly didn't want to be doing it. I felt unwanted without him ever saying a word. The whole aura of the house had changed when Mom was bedridden, and my emotionally unavailable father then ran the show. Once I had learned that Mom couldn't pick me up anymore, that meant that I was no longer a child and I had to act like a grown-up. Mom needed me. Dad needed my help to keep the house running. I made myself grow up right then and there. Again, at only 2 years old, I turned into a codependent. Later in life, Mom's friends would always comment that I was, quote unquote, so mature for my age, and that I would always want to hang out with her friends rather than my own. My own friends seemed so immature and uninteresting. Song, The Weatherman by Blue October. Sidebar, if someone tells you that your kid is quote unquote mature for their age, then you need to get that kid to therapy, and you need to start making sure that your child knows that it is their job to be a kid and nothing more. And it's time for you to start being a parent. It's a big time red flag if you have a mature for their age child, because it means they are taking on adult responsibilities when they shouldn't be. They'll have plenty of time for that later. We need to watch our kids and not let them become adults too quickly. It really, really hurts their future selves when you deny them the freedom to be a kid and grow up feeling overly responsible. Protect your kids emotionally as well as physically, parents. It's important. When Mom healed and was able to walk again, my baby brain was just thrilled to death because it seemed like a miracle. She was out of bed and walking. Hallelujah! I just really had no sense of permanence at that age. It changes how you see things depending on how old you are when you witness them. People forget just how impressionable we really are as kids. No one sat me down to explain it because my dad was cold and unreachable, and I took it upon myself to grow up too young. It fractured my sense of self, my identity, and from that point on, I was growing up focused on doing for other people and becoming a true codependent searching for validation outside of myself. My dad didn't know how to handle his own emotions, so he certainly didn't know how to handle mine when I was little. In that short but formative time span, I learned to shove down my emotions like he had been taught to do, because in this new household that he was running, which I thought was permanent at the time, anything other than well-mannered obedience and polite silence was met with anger and disappointment, verging on annoyance. It was safer if I always stayed quiet. I did what I felt I had to do in order to survive, and that meant always being hyper aware of the adults around me so that my behavior wouldn't upset them in any way. I ignored my own self, feelings, and wants in order to keep the adults around me happy. This is how an empath is made, ladies and gentlemen. In the few months where my mom was in the other room, bedridden, I was able to form a quote-unquote relationship with my dad, which set the standard for what I ended up with in my romantic relationships with men later in life. That was emotionally unavailable and unwilling to communicate, my approval solely based on how perfect and non-demanding I could be, my worth based on what I had to offer and not who I was as a human being. I can't hate him for not showing me the love I wanted and needed from him. It's not that he didn't love me. I know he does as much as he can in his own weird, cold way. When I was younger, he was very awkward about displaying any sort of feelings. He didn't know how to show it and truly allow himself to feel it fully, so he just stayed away or drank. A kid doesn't understand things like that, though. He was not one of those abusive alcoholics, just an absent one. I didn't even know he was an alcoholic until he went to rehab, and he only did that after being forced to, of course, because he felt, as most addicts do, that he had it under control. Right. I didn't even know his drinking was a problem, even living in the house and seeing the Budweiser can beside him as he lay passed out on the couch. I was 10. That was my normal by then. I felt incredibly awkward and shy when the rehab center recommended to Mom that I should attend an Alateen meeting. I immediately rejected that notion. That sounded mortifying to me. And at that point in my life, the worst thing ever was being embarrassed. That meant more shame. Standing up and speaking in front of people or being seen at all, I was too shy to get up and ask the guy behind the counter at McDonald's for more ketchup. Now they wanted me to go to a meeting about alcoholics. I had nothing to say. Everything was fine. I'd had excellent training in the everything's fine category. No one ever explained what it was I really lived in or with. It just wasn't discussed much. So it was fine. I feel I should have been made to go to a few of these meetings. I think hearing other stories from other kids my age might have woken me up a little bit. I wish someone had made me at least try it, but no one did, and so I grew up to be an adult child of an alcoholic. That title bestows its own lovely idiosyncrasies and personality traits that I have only recently learned about. There was a tremendous amount of damage caused and baggage bestowed upon my tiny shoulders, and no one ever had to raise a hand to me. I know that I am not alone in this. I know there are others out there who feel that they have no right to complain about their childhood because it wasn't quote-unquote that bad. This is not a competition of who had it worse. This is admitting that most of us were abused or neglected in one form or another, and we have more in common than we think we do. I know that there are others like me who feel guilty for naming what their parents did to them as abuse, even though it's true. Please, friends, please don't carry that guilt. Don't carry that shame. It's not your burden to bear. You need to drop it. It's so much heavier than you think it is. You experienced trauma. You were let down by those who were supposed to be there for you. They failed you. It's okay to admit these things. In fact, it's imperative that you admit these things. I am sharing these stories so that others can see that they too have the right to stand up and say, hey, it's not cool that I have all these problems because of what my parents taught me when I was just a little kid. But now that I see that I act the way I do because they trained me to act that way, well, now I can retrain myself. I can retrain myself to act the way that I want to, the way that fits more in line with the person that I truly am, where I can make decisions based on what makes me happy, not what would have made my parents happy. Recognize the trauma, name it, accept it, and then start building your new life, because it's going to change everything for the better. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 5. Next week will be chapter 6, entitled The Mental and Physical Health Connection. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see y'all then.